Hey everyone, welcome back to another SAT math video. This one is a little different from the ones I've done before in that we're going to do an entire math module in one video, right? So it just was more time efficient to do it all in one video. And that way you guys don't have to go through a bunch of different videos and find the answer you want. You can just click on one video and go to the chapter of the question that you want to review. So for this one, we're doing all 27 questions from this section. And additionally, I'm going to do it from back to front. So what I mean by that is I'm going to start with question 27 and then I'm going to end in question 1. Why? Because when you start from the back, you have actually more time that you can dedicate to the harder questions. And then you want to spend more time on the harder questions because, they're the ones that will challenge you the most. And then save the later portion of the test for the easier ones, which are usually at the front. So that's why I'm doing it back to front. But again, I'm going to put chapters in this video for each question, so you can use the table of contents or like the chapter guide on YouTube to basically move around as you need. And lastly, if you have any questions for how I'm explaining things, or if something's not clear, in the beginning of your comment, use hashtag explain, and that way I can better address your question because I'll be able to just filter your comment and be like, okay, this person needs hashtag explain, some answer on like y equals x plus b or something like that. But basically, if you use this hashtag explain in your comment, it'll make it easier for me to address your concern. So without further ado, let's get into the test. We're going to start with question 27. I'm going to just go straight into the answers. So if you want to read the problem, just pause the video and read it yourself. So 2 hints here that they're giving us, right? They're telling us that g of 7 minus w is equal to 0. So that's a big hint. And then what are they asking us? They're asking us for the sum of all possible values, right? So that means it's going to be multiple solutions, right? And luckily, they already kind of gave us the equation set to 0, so it's easy to figure out what the multiple solutions will be. All we have to do is plug in 7 minus w everywhere we see x and simplify. So that's what we're going to do. So we have an x at the beginning, and then we're going to plug it in for here too. So 7 minus w minus 2, and then we're going to have 7 minus w plus 6 all squared, right? So then simplifying this, we still have a 7 minus w at the beginning. Then we are left with a 7 minus w minus 2, or a 5 minus w. And then lastly, we have 7 plus 6. That's going to be 13 minus w squared, right? So if this entire equation is equal to 0, then that means any one of these terms can be the one that is 0 to make the rest of the equation equal 0. So that means we're going to need to basically figure out for each of these binomials, what is the value of w that makes the binomial equal to 0. So pretty straightforward. Over here, it's just going to be 7 because 7 minus 7 is 0. Then over here, we have 5, and then lastly 13. And they're asking us to sum all of these up, right? So we just do 5 plus 7 plus 13. So 7 plus 5 is 12. 12 plus 13 is 25, right? So that's all you got to do for this one. Pretty straightforward. Moving on, we're going to go down to the 26. So here they are asking us what? They are basically giving us the zeros of a quadratic equation, right? So this is these are like the 2 solutions, and they are telling us we need to figure out what a plus b is, given that a is an integer greater than 1, right? So the way we're going to start this one is we're going to basically write out what we know. So we know that there is some integer a, right? And we kind of want to get this into a form ax squared plus bx so we can figure out what b is, right, for this particular equation. And the way we can do that is we can use the zeros, right? So x minus 7 will go here, and then we would get an x minus 3, right? So again, these are just basically where our parabola touches the x-axis, right? Because our y values for each of these points is 0. So continuing, we're going to just simplify this now so that we will get a times x squared, and then we will have a 3x minus 7x, so that's going to be minus 4x, and then minus 7 plus times plus 3, that's going to be a minus 21. We don't really care about the c term anyways. And now we're going to distribute the a, so we can make our lives a little bit easier. So then we have ax squared minus 4ax minus 21a. Okay, so now we know what our b term is, right? Because our b term is the one with just an x and no squared, right? So we know that b is going to be equal to minus 4a. So let's figure out what a plus b is. All we got to do is add a on both sides. So a plus b is going to be equal to minus 4a plus a, which is the same thing as minus 3a. Therefore, a plus b is equal to minus 3a. And now we just need to figure out what could be the value of a plus b, right? So we know that a is an integer greater than 1. So a can be anything greater than 1, like 2, 3, 4, right? So we're just going to choose 2. So minus 3 times 2, that's going to be minus 6. So there you have it. A plus b could be minus 6. That's the only one that makes sense out of all of these options. Okay, hopefully not going too fast. If you can't keep up, just rewatch the explanation and or leave a comment for me to slow down, and I'll try and go a little bit slower for that particular problem. Now, this one, the result of increasing the quantity x by 400% is 60. What is the value of x, right? So let's start by writing this one out. All we got to remember is we have our original value x plus 400% increase, right? So we're increasing x by 400%, meaning we are basically just adding 4x, right? So like when, for example, if you're like increasing something by 200%, you would be doing like 200 over 100, right? Which is the same thing as just like timesing that whatever value, let's just say some value a by 2, right? So that's why I did 4x over here. So x plus 4x is equal to 60, or in other words, 5x is equal to 60. And then just real simple divide on both sides by 5, you get x is equal to 12, right? Or a. Pretty simple and straightforward. Moving on to question 24, they are giving us basically two exponential equations, right? And they're asking us, do either one of these have a minimum at minus 3, right? So recall that an exponential equation basically would look something like that, right? Where you have like a line, kind of like a half parabola that grows up as the x value increases. But in this case, we have these negative coefficients. So that means that instead of being like that, it's going to be flipped about the x-axis, and it's going to be kind of like that, pointing down, right? And it's still in the shape of an exponential equation, right? So it's just gonna like kind of like approach zero. You like keep on getting smaller and smaller till infinity, in that direction. And in this direction, it's going to keep on growing exponentially, right, till it reaches infinity. So it doesn't really have a minimum either. Actually, both of these don't have a minimum. So your answer is going to be D. So this one, you just got to think back to your algebra and like how you graph different equations, and you'll kind of get this one really quickly. If not, don't worry. It's just one question. For question 23, here, the trick is to understand what the length, width, and height are, right? Because volume is just simply L times W times H. So H is pretty easy. That's just the height. That's just going to be 9. What is the length? The length is going to be X, right? So L is going to be X. And they're saying the length is 7 inches more than the width. So then the width is just simply going to be x minus 7, right? So the width is just going to be the length of the base minus 7 inches, right? So they kind of were trying to trick you right here, when they said 7 inches more. So then we just got to figure out which one of these is our answer, right? So we just do 9 times x minus 7, which looks like D right there. So pretty straightforward. Just you have to watch out for this part right here. That's probably where they tried to trick you and throw you off, okay? Moving on, we're going to go to question 22. The graph, so yeah, this one is a circle problem, right? All we have to do here is kind of understand, one, what is the center of the circle, and then two, how far left and right on the x-axis can we go, or rather, what is the radius, right? So the center is going to be the point x, where the x is equal to -4. Let me write that a little bit better. So how do I know it's -4? Well, whenever you, like for any, function or equation that is, on a graph, if you see a plus, it's going to be equal minus, right? Because the equation of a circle is x minus h squared plus y minus k squared is going to be r squared. So if I know that if I have like a negative value for h, like say I put in minus h or like -1, it's going to end up as positive, right? Like for example, if I write it over here, x minus -1, right, that becomes a +1. So that's how I know that it's going to be a -4. And then since this is already minus, we know that's going to be 19, right? So that is our center of the circle. And then since we know that the equation of a circle has the r squared at the end, we can just take the square root of this, and that's going to be 11, right? So we know that our radius is going to be equal to 11, right? So they're asking us basically, which of the following is a possible point for A, right? So basically want to see what is a valid value of like x value for a point on this circle, right? Which one of these would be a valid x value for that point? So all we have to do is just basically add 11 to -4, right? Because we want to just basically see the bounds of the circle and the x in terms of x, right? So we want to see how far left we can go on the x-axis, and then same thing for right, right? So all we got to do is let's do -4 plus 11. That's going to be 7. And then -4 minus 11. That's going to give us -15. So that we know A can be less than or equal to 7. And then it also can be greater than or equal to -15. So let's just find an answer that satisfies that. I believe the only one is B, right? So again, this one, all we had to do was figure out the center, and then from the center, we just only cared about the x value, right? Because A is the x value, and we just wanted to see which x values from the options given us would be a valid x value that lies within the bounds of this circle. Okay, moving on to question 21, they're asking us what is the value when g is at g of 0, right? That big hint here is they are giving us one of the zeros, right? When g of x is equal to 24, the equation is equal to 0. So that kind of tells us, like in our parabola, we have like -14 is one of the zeros, and then +24, right? So they're asking us now to calculate g of 0. So first, let's figure out what this means. So if we know that 24 and O is one of the zeros, and then we also know that -14 is another one of the zeros. So our actual quadratic equation is going to look like x plus 14, 24 minus x, right? And we're just going to plug in 0 for both sides. I know it looks a little weird, 24 minus x, but you can like factor out the -1 if you want it to be in like x minus form, right? Instead of having, or basically like have the x in the front of the binomial, but it really doesn't matter. So now just to find out what g of 0 is, all we got to do, plug in 0 for x. So that's going to give us 14 times 24, and then you can put that in your calculator. I'm just going to do it right here real quick. So 14 by 24, 16, carry the 1, 8, 96, and then so basically 96 plus 240, that is going to be equal to 6, and then 4 plus 9 is 13, carry the 1, so 336, right? So that is our answer. So again, all we had to do was recognize that they gave us the other 0, which basically told us what t is, right? So t was going to be 24, and then we just had to plug in 0 for where x was, which gave us 14 times 24, and then that gave us 336. Moving on to the next question, they're asking us what is cosine of x. Recall that Cosine is always going to be the adjacent over hypotenuse. You could use SOHCAHTOA to remember this, right? So it's a pretty basic trigonometry. So all we got to do is identify what the adjacent is. So the adjacent is always going to be the leg that the angle is touching, which is this one. And the hypotenuse is always going to be the longest leg, which is this one, right? So then our answer is just going to be 11 over 28. You can simplify that into a decimal, which would be like point something, but this is really pretty much all you need to do, right? 11 over 28, just put that into your answer. Okay, moving on to another question. So this one, I was doing this one quite a few times because it's very tricky. It's another trigonometry problem, but you need to understand the unit circle. And actually, the answer key is wrong for this one, right? So just take a note that this one, if you look at the answer key, it is actually wrong because they simplify wrong. But anyways, we'll get into the answer. So again, you need to know how to use the unit circle for this problem. It's very important. It's just a good trigonometry skill to have, right? So they give us a angle in radians, right? And they're basically asking us what is the value of tan of that angle. So recall that tan is simply going to be sine over cosine, right? So we just need to figure out the sine and cosine of this angle 92 pi over 3. And if we know that there are 2 pi radians in one revolution of the unit circle, right, we can kind of figure out how many revolutions around the unit circle we're going to, and then based off of that, figure out the sine and the cosine, right? So let's just start by figuring out the number of revolutions. So to do that, we'll just do 92 pi over 3, and then we're going to divide it by 2 pi. So that's the same thing as multiplying it by 1 over 2 pi, right? And then our pi's cancel out, and we will be left with 92 over 6, right? And we can simplify this. So 2 times 46, and then we can have on the bottom 2 times 3. So 2's cancel out, and then 46 over 3. Well, I know that 3 times 15 is equal to 45. So this is nothing more than, if we write it as a mixed number, it's going to be 15 plus 1/3, right? So that's how many revolutions we went around the unit circle, right? We went 15 revolutions and then 1/3, right? And this is all in radians, right? So we just need to remember that we're looking at radians. So now I'm actually going to bring up a picture of the unit circle, and we are going to see where 1/3 pi is. So here is our chart of the unit circle. So we went 15 revolutions all the way around, right? So you can imagine we went like 15 times around the unit circle, and then we left with 1/3, right? So pi over 3. So we have our basically our sine and cosine, right? Because sine and cosine on the unit circle, well, sine is always going to be the y value, and then cosine is always going to be the x value. So we have the point 1 over 2 root 3 over 2, right? So there's a hint there. And all we got to do then is do sine over cosine, right? So what was our sine? Our point was then 1/2 root 3 over 2, and we just got to put the y over the x, right? Because sine is always y, cosine is always x. So then we just divide root 3 over 2, and then divide by 1/2. That's the same as timesing it by 2. So then we are left with our answer of root 3. So D is the answer. And remember, the answer key is wrong on this question. So if you're looking at the answer and you're trying to understand it from the answer key, for some reason they just simplified wrong. So maybe email College Board and let them know that they were lacking. Moving on to the next question. Kaylani, so basically we are being asked to interpret the equation in like what it actually means, right, in the real world. So here they're asking us what the value of 6 is in this equation. So I just like to rewrite it in terms of like, or in the y equals mx plus b form, because they're pretty much giving it to us in that, right? So y is equal to 5x plus 6. And what is y? Y represents the total length of fabric, right? So that's the y is the total. And then x is basically the number of what is that? The number of suits, right? So X is the number of suits made. So she basically, if the total number is Y, so she uses 5 yards per suit plus six, right? So plus maybe she just started with six extra, or she just ended up with six extra. So we know that this is not really pertaining to the number of suits or the total number of yards, right? So we can actually cancel that out because we don't know, or like we can cross that answer out rather, because we know that she definitely did not make just six suits, and we also know that she has to have purchased more than six total yards of fabric. Um, and also, let's look at C. Kaylani used a total of 6 yards to make the suits. Again, this is also wrong. So really the only one you have that makes sense is D, because she purchased 6 yards more than she used to make suits. Because if we look at this, it's kind of like the y-intercept, right? So she uses 5 yards per suit, because remember X is the number of suits, and then plus six. So maybe she just started out with 6 extra yards of fabric. So that's the way to solve this one. Just remember it's in the context of like y equals mx plus v. So always try and think of it, as a graph, or like what would the y-intercept mean in the context of that particular problem. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next question, number 17. At a particular track meet, ratio of coaches, blah, 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 right? So what are they asking us here? They are asking us to basically understand what is the how can we represent the number of athletes for each coach, right? Because they're telling us there is one coach per 26 athletes, right? That is the ratio, right? So that when we interpret ratios, you can kind of think of it as like something per something else, right? So for every one coach, there's going to be 26 athletes, right? That's what this ratio means. So if there are X coaches, that means there's going to be, for every X coach, there's going to be 26 athletes, right? So which one of these kind of tells you that? 26 per X, right? So that's the only one that is like that is B, right? Again, so it's one coach per 26 athletes. If there are X coaches, that means there's going to be 26 times X athletes. Okay, so that's why we have B is our answer, 26x. Moving on to question 16. They give us a graph over here, right? They give us some sort of function y equals f of x. And what are they asking us? They are asking us how the graph would look if we shifted it up 5, right? Because what are they doing here? They're giving us a second graph, y equals f of x plus 5. And they want to see which one of these answers will be the one that looks like that. So the only one, right, that is shifted up by 5 units is D, right? And how did I know that? Well, I looked at this graph that they gave us, and I just found one point that I could easily track, and shift up. And that point is this one right here. If you look at the very end, you can see when x is equal to 10, y is equal to 1. So we just got to find the other answer choice where the very last point on the graph is shifted up. So we would expect it, if it's plus 5, right? We would expect that last point to be shifted up to 6. And the only one that has that is D, right? So the concept here is you need to know how to translate functions. So this is like shifting and translating functions, right? So that's something you probably learned it in like algebra 2 or calculus, but that's kind of the concept you need to understand here, how to shift and translate functions. But if you knew how to do that, anytime you have a plus 5 after a function, or like plus or minus after some function, is the vertical shift, right? So here we just have to find the graph that was this graph basically, but shifted up 5 units, right? So that's all you have to do. Moving on to question 15, this is basically a geometry problem. They're asking us to calculate the volume of a cylinder, and this equation for the volume of, or the formula rather, for the volume of a cylinder is given to you in the references section. So I literally just pulled it from there. It's pi r squared times h, right? Where h is the height of the cylinder, r is the radius of the base, right? So let's just write out what we know, right? We know that h is equal to 6. What is r? They don't give us r, but they instead give us the diameter. So instead of r being 22, it's actually going to be 11, right? Because the diameter is basically 2r, right? Like if we have a circle, that is r, right? Just that distance right there. And then the distance across the entire circle is the diameter, right? So that's a little where they're trying to trick you up. right? So just be mindful of that. When they give you diameter, it's always going to be 2 times the radius, or in other words, the radius is half the diameter, right? So let's just plug that into our equation, right? So we have pi times r squared, which is going to be 11 squared, right? And then times h was going to be 6. So that is equal to pi times 121, right? Because 11 squared is 121. So we have 121 here. And then times 6, right? I don't know why that times 6 went away. And then we're just going to do 6 times 121. So our volume is going to be equal to 6 times 121 times pi. And luckily they gave us all our answers in terms of pi, so we don't actually have to times the pi into our final answer, right? We just leave it outside, or like kind of like how they're given right here. So 6 times 1 is 6. 6 times 2 is 12. Carry the 1. And then 6 times 1 is 6 again, plus 1, 726. And remember, we have that pi, so there's our answer, 726 pi. Pretty straightforward. You literally are given this equation at the beginning of this section. Only tricky part here was they gave us the diameter, so you have to remember the diameter is equal to 2 times the radius of our circle, all right? So that's kind of where they're trying to get you. Moving on to the next question, question 16. Here they're asking us to interpret the equation, right? So you really just need to read the question very carefully. You don't have to do much math, right? So they give us the total in dollars, right? The total sales in dollars, and they give us also this equation, right? So this equation is basically 4.51x, whatever. And then that represents the situation for the store. And they're telling us X is the number of smaller containers and Y is the number of larger containers, right? So X is the smaller, Y is the larger, and then this answer is in dollars, right? So they're asking us what is the price in dollars of each smaller container, right? So we know that if X is the number of smaller containers and you get 4.51 per X, what is this 4.51 going to be? Well, if we know that the final answer is in dollars, that means that we get 4.51 what? $4.51 per small container, right? So our answer is going to be nothing more than 4.51, right? Because we just had to interpret the equation. So I don't really know how else to explain it other than you just got to read it slowly and kind of use a little bit of logic, right? But don't be discouraged if you didn't immediately get it. It's just something you got to keep practicing, right? Moving on to question 13. They are giving us two equations and they're asking us what is the value of x, and they're giving us this constraint where x is greater than 0. So right off the bat, I know this is going to be a kind of like a quadratic equation where you have to find multiple solutions, right? So let's just get right into it. So I'm just going to solve this by setting they give us two values of y. So that means we can set these two equations equal to each other like so. So 4x is equal to x squared minus 12. Anytime you have like a squared term, you want to bring all the x's over to one side and set the entire thing equal to 0. So I'm going to do that. So just basically put a 0 right here and then minus 4x on both sides. Okay, so then we are getting basically 0 is equal to x squared minus 4x minus 12, and now we need to factor it, right? So how do we factor this? Well, we have this c term right here. We need to figure out what two numbers multiplied together equal minus 12, and when added up together equals minus 4, right? So the only ones that do that are 2 times minus 6, right? Because 2 times minus 6 is going to be minus 12, and then 2 plus minus 6 is going to be minus 4. And then our factored form of this quadratic is going to be x minus, or x plus 2, right? X plus 2. And then we get an x minus 6, right? I think that should be good, right? Well, actually, let me just double check that. If you don't know where the plus and minus go, we can always write it this way, right? So we can just kind of factor it like this. So we can just split up the b term, right? So x squared is going to be plus 2x minus 6x minus 12. And let's just factor it from here, right? So these two terms, the common factor is going to be x, and then it's going to be the same thing as x times x plus 2. And then for these two terms, the common factor is minus 6. So then it's going to be minus 6 times the quantity x plus 2. Okay, so yeah, I was right the first time. So basically we can factor these out from both of these two terms, right? So then we get 0 is equal to x minus 6 and then x plus 2. Yeah, I just want to double check myself. But so yeah, basically that is our factored form of this equation. And what are the solutions for this? Well, basically we need to figure out what values of x make this equation true. So x can only be, right, 6, because 6 minus 6 is 0. Then that says the whole equation is 0. And then minus 2, right, because minus 2 plus 2 is going to be 0. But remember, we have this constraint, right? So then our only answer is going to be x plus 6. Okay, now let's move on to the next problem. We are given another, this is question 12, so we're given another interpretation type problem where we need to interpret what they're telling us. So they are basically giving us like a constraint, or not constraint, but like we need to figure out how to write out this inequality that they're giving us, right? So they're saying the minimum was 0.6 inches per hour, and then the maximum was 1.8 inches per hour. So that should be the bounds of our inequality. So right off the bat, I know that is wrong because they didn't say anywhere that the rate is going to be greater than 2.4. It's like within the range, right? The maximum is 1.8. So we shouldn't have S be greater than 1.8 at any point, right? So again, this is wrong. Here, the bounds just don't make sense because they never mentioned a 0. So this is just also wrong because, again, we should have 0.6 at the bottom end, right? At the lower end, 0.6 is less than or equal to, or rather, the rate is greater than or equal to 0.6 and less than or equal to 1.8, right? That's basically what they're telling us. And the only one that is D, right? So you have to just be very careful and understand what they meant over here, right? If they say a minimum, it's always going to be that your lower bound is going to be where they say minimum, and then your upper bound is going to be where 1.8, right? So that's how you do this one. Pretty straightforward. You just have to read very carefully and use process of elimination. Moving on to question 11. So here they're asking us for the value of x minus 7, and you might be tempted to just solve for x and then minus 7 once you solve for x, but there's actually a faster way you can do this one. So if we notice that our equation is all in terms of like multiples of 4, right, and we can just kind of divide out the 4, right, because if you look here, 4 times minus 7 would be minus 28, right? Or rather 24 times 7 is 28. So all we got to do is just divide the 4 out, and then this side just will become x minus 7, right? Because 4 times 7 is 28, right? So if we divide by this side, we can just divide by 4 on this other side, right? So 24 by 4. So x minus 7 is just going to be minus 24 divided by 4, which is the same as minus 6. Pretty straightforward. Just a little hack for you. You don't really need to do a lot of math here, but the trick is, could you do it in the fastest way possible, right? So it's not super complicated, but there were definitely a faster way to do it, which I just showed you. Moving on to question 10. Here we just kind of have to interpret what they are telling us, right? So they are telling us out of 20 employees, 16 had the enrollment in the professional development courses, right? And they're kind of trying to confuse us by saying, oh, in only 3, they're giving us this other number. We don't really care about that. What are they asking us? They're just basically asking us the best estimate of the number of employees who are enrolled in exactly 3 professional development courses, right? So basically, we just need to extrapolate this estimate for the entire population, right? So they're telling us 16 out of 20 are enrolled. So let's just reduce that fraction. This is going to be basically 4 out of 5, right? So 4 out of every 5 employees are enrolled in like this professional development programs, right? So we just got to multiply this 4 out of 5 proportion times 400. Okay, very simple. And I'm just going to then simplify this a little bit more. So 5 goes into 400. Well, I know 5 times 8 is 40. So this is actually just going to be 1. And this is going to be 8 plus an extra 0. So 80. So this is the same thing as 4 times 80, which is nothing more than 4 times 8 is 32, and then keep that extra 0. So we will get 320, right? Looks kind of ugly, but there you go. So that's how you have to do this one. Just you have to basically understand that they gave us a proportion for like the probability or proportion or probability of how many are enrolled in that, and then you just had to use that proportion on the entire population of employees to get your answer. Okay, pretty straightforward. Don't feel discouraged if you didn't initially get it. You just got to keep practicing, right? Now let's go to question number 9. What are they asking us here? They're asking us how many minutes of non-daylight is in this particular day. And they're telling us that X is the number of minutes of daylight and Y is the number of minutes of non-daylight, right? What do they give us? They give us X and we just need to solve for Y, right? Because X is what? The minutes of daylight. And here again, minutes of daylight is represented by X. So we just need to solve for Y. So 670 plus y is equal to 1440, right? So y is going to be equal to 1440 minus 670, and I'm just going to write that out over here. You would use your calculator because it is faster. I don't have a calculator, so I'm just going to do it by hand and just subtract it all out. So here we get a 3, 14, then a 7, and then take that away. So then we get 770 as our answer. Okay, pretty straightforward. The trick here was identifying what 670 was, what 670x or 670y. Again, you just have to read very carefully, because they purposely made it very confusing, minutes of daylight and non-daylight. So just read slowly. You'll understand which one is x, like daylight was X, non-daylight was Y, and then you'd be able to solve, right? Pretty straightforward mathematically. You just, again, read carefully. Moving on to question 8. Now these questions are getting pretty easy, right? At least I think so. So in this one, they're basically asking us which statement is true, right? And all they're doing is kind of comparing X to 145. So I'm not even going to read any of these answers yet. I'm just going to interpret this graph first. So right off the bat, anytime you have like two angles opposite of each other, I believe it's called vertical angles. I don't really remember. But nonetheless, if you have multiple angles across like a vertex or intersection like that, the ones opposite each other, like directly on top of each other, they're always going to be the same. Like, so this is going to be the same as that. This one, right? This angle is going to be the same as this angle, right? I believe it's called vertical angles. I'm not entirely sure of the right term. You can look up in your geometry textbook what the actual name is, but all I remember is that angles that are on the same vertex that are opposite each other, they're always going to be the same, right? So X is going to equal 145. Which one of these tells us that? C, right? So I wish I had a better way of explaining this one to you other than you just kind of have to know it. So just study up geometry, do some geometry practice because this is like a very fundamental geometry property of vertical angles. So if you didn't get it, don't worry, just hit the books and you'll get right. So that's how you have to do number 8. Now let's move on to question number 7. They're asking us the range, right? Range is always going to be the minimum minus the maximum, right? So that's just kind of like a statistics concept you need to remember. Oh, that's like too big. Let me make that a little bit smaller. Yeah, so again, range, this is a really straightforward problem. You don't really need to do a lot of math here. You just need to remember, again, the statistics concept. So range is always going to be the maximum minus the minimum, okay? So we just got to figure out what our maximum is here. Just looking at our data points, we have a 52 as a max, and then what is the minimum? Looks like 23, right? So we just got to figure out what 52 minus 23 is going to be, right? And I believe that's going to be 29. Let me just write it out over here. 52 minus 23. Again, if you do this in your calculator, you should be like already done with this problem, right? So 4 and then 12 minus 3, that's going to be 9. Yeah, 29. Okay, so our answer is 29 for this one. Again, you really just need to remember when they ask for range, it's going to be the maximum data point minus the minimum data point. Okay, moving on to question number 6. They're asking us for the x value of this solution of equations. and they give us the graph, right? So whenever you have a system of linear equations, the solution is going to be the intersection or intersections between the systems of equations, right? So we need to figure out where these points intersect. Here we know that they intersect right here. What is this point? This point is going to be 4, right? Because the x-axis has a 4 there, so it's at 4. And then just be careful, we got to make sure that we're looking at our axis, right? So here it's at 1, right? That's not -1, because I almost thought it was -1, but -1 is down here, right? So our point of intersection is 4 minus 1, and they're asking us what is the value of x, so it's just going to be 4, right? You probably didn't even, if you understood that the solution is where the points intersect, you really only needed to just figure out the x value, right? You didn't even need to care about the y value. But if you're like a super pro, you could probably do it that way. But for those of you that are still learning, that's how you would do it. Okay. Moving on to question number 5. They're basically giving us some data points, and they're asking us what is the best description of the function, and they're telling us, is it linear, is it exponential, and then or is it increasing or decreasing, right? Let's figure out the first problem. Is it linear or exponential? So if I look at this table of data, every time we increase x, right, it's increasing by 1, right? From 16 to 17, that's 1. From 0 to 1, 17 to 18 increases by 1. So if it's increasing by the same amount each time, that is a very good indication that it is not exponential, but it is linear, right? So we can instantly cross out those two, okay? So now let's see, is it decreasing or increasing? So as we increase x, right, because we're going from -1 to 2, so that's increasing. As we're increasing, is the value increasing as well? Well, that it is, right? Because look, we start at 16, and as we increase, we ended up at 19. So it's going to be increasing linear, right? So you just have to interpret the data and understand what is linear versus exponential, and then how to interpret if it's increasing or decreasing, right? So linear is going to increase by a constant rate, right? So linear basically means it increases by a constant rate. So I'm just going to say delta is constant, right? Delta just means change, constant. As you can see, I'm not an English tutor, right? Because I wrote that wrong. And then increasing, if something is increasing, that means as x goes up, f of x also goes up, okay? So there's just some notes you can take if you can even read them, right? So now we're going to go to question 4. What is the solution of RS, right? Given the system of equations, and they already give us R, right? So right off the bat, we know A is wrong and D is wrong, right? Because R has to be 3, and these ones give us some other value that's not 3, right? So that's why I eliminated those. And now we're just going to plug in R to this equation and solve for S, right? So set S is equal to, or S plus 7 times R, which is 3, is equal to 27, and then that simplifies to 21. So now I'm going to minus 21 from both sides, right, to get S by itself. So S is going to be equal to 27 minus 21, or 6, right? So R is equal to 3, S is equal to 6. The solution is R comma S, so it should be 3 comma 6, right? So that's how you do this one. Pretty straightforward. Just have to remember systems of equations, and you kind of just have to plug it in, right? Just plug in R where you saw R in the other equation, and then that is how you got the solution, okay? Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3. Now we're moving on to question 3. What are they asking us? They're basically asking us, what is the y-intercept of this graph? Y-intercept is anywhere where the line of the graph or any function touches the y-axis, right? So we just have to figure out, where does it touch the y-axis? It's going to touch it at 8 right here, right? So our answer is going to be D, right? 0, 8. Doesn't touch it at -8, touches it at 8, right? So pretty straightforward. You just have to remember what the y-intercept of a graph means, okay? Now let's move on to question 2. On the first day of a semester, what are they asking us here? They are basically asking us, after 4 days, how many people are in the club, right? And they tell us each day after the first day, 10 new members join, and then no members leave, right? So we start with 90, And then after the first day, 10 members join each day, right? And how many days after are we need to calculate? We need to calculate 4 days after, right? So we do 10 times 4, right? So it's just going to be 90 plus 40, which is nothing more than 130, right? Very straightforward. You just kind of had to understand what they were asking us, right? They were just asking us how many members joined after 4 days if 10 new members come each day, right? Which would be 130. So pretty straightforward. Don't feel discouraged if you didn't get it right. It is a pretty straightforward problem, but you just need to practice more, right? Always just need to practice. That's what it comes down to for the SAT. And finally, question 1, the graph is shown here with 2 lines, and they're asking us what is the solution. All we got to do, like we kind of did in a couple other problems, is just find the point of intersection, right? The point of intersection is right here. That's going to be our solution. So we just got to make sure that we figure out and write out the point correctly, right? So let's do the x first. The x coordinate seems to be at 4, right? So we have 4, and then where is our y? Y is at 5. So 4 comma 5 is our answer, and our answer will be C. So we just did the entire practice set for module 2 or module 1 from the practice test 5. Hopefully this made sense to you. Let me know in the comments if at any point you needed more explanation for any one of the questions. Remember to use hashtag explain in your comments so I can filter it a little bit easier and then address your queries in a more efficient manner. Thank you so much for watching. Check out Khan Academy, and I will see you in the next video.